new author, a new paperback out. We'll talk a little bit about that later. We were hoping to have Sarah Jones, Labour's Shadow Policing Minister, on the programme, but she's had to drop out due to an emergency. So we are but three, and I recognise we are an all-male panel. We'll just have to show a little bit of feminine side. You're very good at that, Geoff, I know, sort of. And you can watch us on Global Player. Now, we have cleared the board from the last hour, so there are plenty of spaces. If you want to ask our panel a question, just pick up the phone and dial 0345 6060 973. You can text your question to 84850, and you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, let's go to our first question. It's from Billy on the Isle of Wight. Hello, Billy.
Hi, good evening, Iain, and good evening, panel. My question is based around the electricity and gas increases. The government so far have only offered, I think, it's around £200, and that's a loan that people have to pay back. With gas prices, electricity prices going up by 54%, I think, between now and October overall. I want to know what the panel think about affordability. What's going to be offered to people that are currently falling through the cracks and not able to pay and are having to choose between heating and eating? And what do you think needs to be done in terms of the people that are heading that way as well? Because it's a real disaster that I think is waiting to happen.
Paul Mason.
Well, and it's not, and it's going to get worse because the whole price cap lift that we've just had was all contingent on shortages of energy, etc., energy demand. But now we've got the war with Ukraine, and gas and oil prices are going to get worse. What can we do? No, there's no Labour spokesperson here. I'm certainly not, although I'm a party member, I don't speak for them. I think
you're the nearest thing we got.
Yeah, but so look, they've said a windfall tax on energy companies. That gets you maybe $1.5 billion. You can give that back in, and I certainly think this loan thing is a bit of a non-gesture, but I would say more. I think we're going to have a more rigorous regime of price capping, both on energy and on food, because food prices are going to go through the roof. Wheat prices, anybody tried to get sunflower oil, it's rationed. I think we're going to see families who would count themselves middle class, or the famous sort of just getting along, pushed into not food poverty but hard choices, like Billy said. And I think that price capping is one option. Now, people obviously often take a deep breath. It would mean the government saying, as with energy, your household energy bill, there are other things that have to be price capped. Local public transport, some basic foodstuffs. And people say, well, that sounds like communism to me. Rents. Rents are capped in New York City. Cost of medical treatment, where you have to pay for it, can be capped. So I think we have to think about that. And we have to think about a regime of subsidy for the poorest. None of that gets you out of the problem that many of these families who are facing these issues, and I know people who are, didn't already started in with not much and with jobs that are quite precarious. So I'm also worried about the kind of anxiety in the population, because it's one thing to be juggling heating versus eating, or standing in the queue at Tesco waiting for those yellow label discounted products to come on at 5 o'clock. But it's the rest of the day people have to spend thinking about it that I think is utterly stressful. So I would like to see the government do more.
Robert Buckland, the French seem to manage to cap their energy prices. We have a regulator, Ofgem, which I think is widely considered to be one of the most hopeless regulators of all. I think we possibly all agree on that one. But it is not beyond the wit of government to introduce the same sort of price cap that the French have introduced. Why haven't they done it already?
Well, I think we start at a very difficult position. I think the energy market, as we call it, is the most bizarre and odd creation. It's a creature of statute. It's a creature of all sorts of well-intentioned interventions. Well, look, I remember doing the energy bill back in 2013 and frankly finding the whole thing extraordinary. We got to a position where we were trying to offer incentives and floor price. I mean, I'm not going to bore listeners with all this, but it is important in terms of the context of where we've got to. And the market's failed. Let's be absolutely frank about it. We've got a situation. Let's take a family who perhaps are having to use a key meter to pay for their energy. They pay more per unit than you or I do on direct debit, and that's just ridiculous. That's not a free market. That's a complete inversion of it. We need to change that. We need a social tariff. I think where I'd part company on Paul. I mean, Paul's talking about comprehensive price caps on all sorts of commodity goods and items. It does sounding a bit like where we were in the 70s, and I'm not going to make glib comparisons with different economic circumstances, but the experience of having price caps in the past is that at some point the cap comes off and then you end up with a massive jump in cost.
But the pandemic has shown us
that
the governments can take radical action when they want to.
Absolutely right, and I think everybody saw the power of government in the 400 billion that we shelled out to keep people in work and to keep jobs and the economy going. I think that as the year progresses, we're going to see, first of all, people are making choices now. We see consumer spending dropping. People already voting with their purses and their wallets to say, look, we're making choices and tough choices. And it seems to me that it is inevitable, I think, that the Treasury will be asked to come to more direct interventions later in the year if we're to see another hike in the current cap regime. I can't see any other way round it, and I think in particular what we should be doing now is taking action to prevent these egregious costs that exist, particularly for people who have to use key meters.
Geoff, in your book, Where Did I Go Right?, which we'll talk about a little bit later, I think I remember you talking about the shy Tory syndrome. I think there's a new syndrome here. It's people who do not want to admit that they are struggling, that they find it embarrassing. Somehow they're ashamed of it, even though it's not their fault. And whenever I do a sort of cost of living crisis phone-in, I'm always surprised that the phones don't ring off the hook for these phone-ins. And you would automatically think, well, if there's a real problem here, you ought to be getting huge numbers of phone calls. And I put it down to that kind of syndrome.
It's not a nice thing to have to say, is it?
It's not, actually, but I think we should talk about it, because I think there'll be a lot of people listening saying, I don't want to tell the world about my problems.
Yeah, no, I think Paul makes a good point there about the people that were struggling coming into this current set of cost of living crisis. I can remember when the credit crunch hit. I've been skint for the previous 5 years, and everyone was saying, the party's over. I was going, I never attended the party. I never got an invite to that party. So
Whereas now,
well, I don't know, mate. I just had a new kitchen, which just sounds like the ultimate Mondeo man problem, but it has been difficult making toast in the bedroom. But I mean, frivolous things aside, it is really hard. I think that the one problem the Labour Party might have is that this windfall tax, say they were in government, this would buy them weeks in terms of credit with the public. If you're looking for a proper left-wing policy, I don't think that it really delivers at all. But what I would want from either party is transparency and honesty about the cost of these things, because you talk about caps, they create a cost, and then the next argument is always tax the rich. Well, mostly we see that tax the rich is a subjective idea, and we get a lot of people who don't even realise they're in the top 5% of earners. There might be people who are struggling, like you say, that are still parroting that line about tax the rich, but might be the target of those tax rises.
I don't think taxing the rich is on this occasion the way to solve it. We do face a problem that Rishi Sunak at the spring statement did tie his own hands, because he basically wants to do everything without increasing taxing or spending, and that's why it's a loan, and so you can account for it. Eventually, we get the money back. If you're looking for a red-blooded socialist answer to this, and it's not that socialist, it's basically the energy system needs to come more into the domain of the public ownership, more, not totally, than in private. And the argument I would put there is not that you've just got families, and Billy's asking us this question, families facing fuel poverty, home and eat, choosing which lights to switch on. The country has an energy security problem, because we have the problem that Russia might switch our gas and oil off. We're trying to switch our supply because of the Ukraine war. We've also got the problem that we have to navigate this energy security problem while we're navigating the climate change issue and getting off oil and gas. So doing all those things, you've said, Robert, the market's failed, and I agree with you. I don't think a market can solve those problems. You have to be at the state, the government has to be at the centre of the solution of affordability, security, and greening the energy system. You can't do it on a sort of one of those websites where you go and choose the lowest rate. That doesn't work.
And I think Paul, in many ways, Paul and I disagree violently on many things. But on this, I think he's making the point about the short and the long-term issue. And you mentioned France, Ian. The French, made those long-term investments in nuclear and really sorted out their energy supply issue. They are a net exporter of energy. That's what happens. They sell electricity to other countries in Europe. Do you know, in Britain, in the late 80s, we were exporting energy. It was the only time in our history we were exporting energy. And we have progressively left that position to a position of dependence upon other countries. And I think that is a mistake. I think quite clearly we need to be doing all these things at once. So we need some of the short-term help for the hard-pressed families making choices that our caller talks about, but we need to get on with this long-term agenda of diversifying our energy supply and creating energy security. That word security, I think, is so important now for many, many listeners.
Do you think the system of government is up to the challenge here? Because we need to look to the long term in all sorts of different policy areas. Energy, you're absolutely right, but we can all think of other ones that need radical reforming. And you look at the current government, forget all the Partygate and the war in Ukraine and all the other issues. You just wonder if there's enough space for them to even get to grips with the scale of these problems.
Well, this is about... Sorry, Geoff, forgive me, I'll come in because I'm recently in the government. It's all about, the energy...
Still be there.
Well, Ian, thank you. I've still got a lot of energy, and I think this is the point, right? It's the willpower of ministers and the energy they have to actually drive change that is so important. And, the Prime Minister has clearly set out his vision on nuclear. He's right, he's bang on. I think the energy policy is right. Get on with it.
Spend some money on it.
Well, and deliver. And now we've got...
Not Chinese money,
yeah, well, indeed. But we've now, we've got that certainty. What does that mean? That means investors should, with confidence, be able to invest in long-term infrastructure development. The problem's been that government's been and in for years about particular nuclear. And now we've got a very clear steer. It's up to ministers to keep on reinforcing that message and get out there to draw in that investment that we need in order to rebuild our energy supply.
Well, I was just thinking with this Conservative government, arguably the only thing they can do is the difficult things. That's the odd thing, isn't it? When it comes to working with the private sector on vaccines, when it comes to whatever you think about, what's happening in Brexit at the moment, actually extricating ourselves from the EU and getting that deal, giving this country freedom a lot sooner than a lot of European countries have actually done a decent job on that. It's the simple things that they've got wrong, which is, following their own rules in Parliament and conducting debate in a transparent and 100% honest way. But actually, you're saying, do they have the kind of gumption and the drive to do something like this? I think they might, but that isn't just the role of government, is to do the big things. It's to do the other things on an ongoing basis. And going back to the point about what governments can do, you can have price caps, but I do fear that they are things that one day have to go away. And maybe some of the government's caution about that is realising the difficulty of doing that. Once they come in, people will construct their finances around that.
And there's nobody in government to do the work anyway because they're all at home.
They're all in their gym jams.
According to Jacob Rees-Mogg.
They're all on their pelotons, Ian.
We had a question on that last night. Maybe we'll have one tonight. Who knows? More questions to our panel in just a moment. If you'd like to put in a call, 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes past 8.
LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8 on LBC. You're listening to or watching Cross Question. You can watch us, on Global Player. We have Sir Robert Buckland. I feel really weird calling you sir.
Yeah. Well, I feel weird. I keep on looking over my shoulder when people talk about. Who are they talking about? Oh, it's me.
Have you had the sword done?
No, I'm not.
No.
No, apparently, like many other things, there's a backlog. So, members of the royal family being press ganged into doing these ceremonies, very important ceremonies.
Well, it can't be too long before it's Sir Paul Mason as well, and indeed Sir Geoffrey Norcott.
Yes.
Establishment shield, I've been called.
Exactly.
Why not make it official?
Right, let's go to another question. It's Peter in Harrow. Hello, Peter. Oh, no, it's a text question. Peter says, should we believe the Russians when they say we're heading towards World War III? Well, of course, today, James Heappey, the Defence Minister, has said that he thinks it's quite right for Ukraine to target targets inside Russia. Well, Russia has reacted very, very badly to that and have promised appropriate retaliation. We're going to be talking about this much more after 9, so I'll be interested in your views on that. Robert Buckland, was James Heappey right to say that?
Yeah, he's absolutely right to support, justify actions by Ukraine to defend itself. And if
But does that mean hitting targets inside the Russian borders?
Yeah, linked to the defence of Ukraine, where clearly, this is a country, a sovereign country that's been invaded. And, the language of war, it's extraordinary. So now Russia's talking about war. At the beginning of this conflict, they would, it was like the language of Vietnam, police action, security. They would deny, they didn't want to touch the word war. And now, Lavrov and the others are talking about the West escalating a war. Come on, they can't have it both ways. The truth is that there's nothing, I'm afraid, we can believe coming out of the Kremlin anymore. It is a dreadful state of affairs that a permanent 5 member of the UN Security Council is behaving in this way. It's gangsterish. It's totally in breach of every tenet of international law. We can't believe a word they say at the moment, and that's a deep.
But does a shudder not run down your spine when you hear them saying, well, effectively, Britain is our number one enemy now, and we will retaliate against you?
Well, I think we knew that we were pretty much up in the top 5, if not the top 1, for a long time. That's nothing new. All we are doing is reinforcing the principle of self-determination. It's a well-known international principle, sovereign state of Ukraine, which Russia itself agreed to the creation of back in 1991, signed treaties about, which they're now trampling over, has been invaded by another state. That is an act of war. It is illegal. It is in breach of every tenet of international law, and we're seeing war crimes.
But it's not an act of war against us. I mean, the question here is, we have involved ourselves in this more than possibly most other European countries. Was that a wise decision?
It was the only decision, bearing in mind the fact that what we are facing is not just an attack on Ukraine, it is an attack on values as well. This is a country, Russia, that was looking increasingly enviously at a developing democracy whose standards of living were increasing. The people of Ukraine, including Russian speakers, by the way, wasn't this old divide between East and West Ukraine? That's changed since 2014. Russian speakers and ethnic Russians were enjoying freedom and increased standards of living in a much fairer society than in Russia. That's what really got Putin's goat. Plus the fact he's got this strategic obsession with the coast of Ukraine, whether it's the Sea of Azov or indeed Odessa. The old obsession of the Russians with Odessa and the steppes at Odessa, if you know that amazing city. It's history repeating itself.
Geoff?
I think it is a strange situation. I was thinking about this on the way here, is where are we all, if we're honest, with this conflict? I think the sad truth is we're all hoping it will somehow fizzle out and come to a sort of fudged conclusion. And from the moment there was a couple of stories in the news, there was the Will Smith thing, there's been other things since. It was almost like it feels like it's sidelined, and I don't think that that's healthy in a way. I think that it's very real still for the Ukrainian people. I'm glad that we are first and foremost in Russia's minds. Whether or not it's wise, to me, isn't the question. Is whether or not it's the right thing. And if you talk about provocation, invading a sovereign country is provocation in itself. The question, the next question is about how far you get involved as to whether it would widen and cause more suffering and harm. I think that's a legitimate question as to whether or not that would do any good. But I think the level at which this country is offering support for Ukraine is something I'm very comfortable with.
But with what James Heappey said, what do you think the agenda was there? I mean, assuming it wasn't just something he blurted out, because he doesn't seem to me to be the kind of person that does that.
Can I be honest? I mean, I think that, seeming tough against Russia's no bad thing for a government minister, is it? And there's certainly it's something that the public want to see. So it's both the right thing to do and politically useful. It's been useful for Boris as well, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't the right thing to do. I mean, I saw a lot of cynicism about Boris Johnson going out to Ukraine and say, well, he's just taking the photo ops. Yeah, he might be doing that, but that has been true throughout history in terms of making stands against aggressors.
Paul, the last time we spoke, you were in Ukraine.
That's right, yeah.
You've been back quite some time now. It must seem quite a long time ago.
Well, my head's been there every day because of what I was doing was setting up links with civil society, trade unions, lefties, like me. I wonder whether I could. I know your listeners can't see this. I want to show you this off my mobile phone. It's a snapshot taken by a friend of mine who's serving with the territorial defence brigades in Kiev with his unit. I wonder whether you recognise this weapon that is in their van. What about you, Robert? It's a green painted small machine gun with a shield. Yes. World War II buffs. Yes. Well, look it up, Google it. Yes. It's a Maxim from 1944. Okay, so these guys are defending their city with World War II equipment, and it works. So when I hear people say, don't send any more weapons because it can only cause more suffering, it sticks in my craw. But as to the question, which came from Peter, I do think we're dealing with a dictator, a totalitarian. I think he's rational, but I think in his the scripts that he has for how this conflict could end, all Russian military scripts have in them the idea of what they call escalate to de-escalate. So if something happens they can't live with, like they get smashed in the Donbass by some British artillery that happens to fire 15 kilometres over the Russian border, how terrible when they're bombing Ukrainian cities to bits. If they start losing big time, there will be a faction that says, drop a small nuclear bomb and see what the West does. I think listeners have to understand that's in their mindset. And I think one of the reasons for Mr. Heapy and others in the government and other Western governments, you see, we've had them today, the Lloyd Austin from the Secretary of Defense of the USA saying, we're going to weaken you and Ukraine's going to effectively win, is that when you hear those signals, we might drop a nuclear bomb on you. We might start World War III. It's kind of when you're down the pub, there is a logical part of one's arsenal that says, don't talk about it. Just let your actions be the guide to how you are. And by the way, we've got things we can do to you. I'm afraid that's where we are, and it saddens me because I've got, as I say, this friend who's only in his 20s sitting there in the freezing cold with a Maxim gun. It can't be fun. And for those who've been bombed out, raped, tortured, it's awful. But my experience in Kiev was this is a nation that is ready for being part of the Western world. It wants to be part of Europe. Its young people want to be dancing to the same sounds that our young people dance to. And what they don't want is a kind of totalitarian dictatorship, holy war. Final point. When we're talking about can we use British weapons on Russian territory, remember this. Every part of the Ukraine Russia has conquered, it is declared to be Russian. I mean, even Kherson, this city on the Dnieper River, it's saying we're going to have a referendum now. Kherson's Russian. Well, what are you supposed to do? Not fire into enemy territory in a war?
Paul's point is bizarre. Really powerful. I've got like many MPs, I've got constituents who actually been out there with humanitarian help in the region, and he sent me a message earlier today from a resident of Kherson who is making the point that the Russians are having a vote, which is really a vote at gunpoint, to get citizens to vote in favour of the absorption of that region into Russia. They're trying to, take bite-sized chunks out of this nation and gobble it up bit by bit through bogus votes at the barrel of a gun. That's what's going on now.
But you see, even now, when I've done phone-ins on this, you'll get people phoning in saying, well, there was a referendum in Crimea and people voted to join Russia. You think, well, yeah, but Do you know the details of that referendum, etc.?
It's the sort of, I mean, I prefer to call it a plebiscite, and with all the connotations that the word plebiscite has, those between the wars plebiscites that were not free and fair, and I'm afraid, it's anything but free and fair. Where are the election observers? Where's the international community and their input in monitoring all of this? None. And that tells you, it speaks volumes about the reality of what's going on.
Well, it still ought to be. Geoff, your point about, it sort of slips off the agenda from time to time, you're absolutely right. And I often think, well, what do we do for a 9 o'clock phone-in? We talk about different subjects. And my constant thought is that really more important than Ukraine? And very few of them are.
But we've got to keep our what we're defending, and I say we in the broadest sense of UK civil society and the West and Europe, our allies in Europe, we're defending that kind of society where other things can be important. The problem is in Russia right now, everything 24/7 on state-owned radio programs, because that's all there is, and TV programs, because everything else is cancelled. It's 24/7 war. It's 24/7 genocidal rhetoric.
Operation.
Yes, but genocidal rhetoric against Ukrainians and the West. And we want a society where people can, you make jokes about it, talk about other stuff. That's what we're actually defending.
Right, more questions for the next half an hour with Robert Buckland, Paul Mason and Geoff Norcott. 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. It's 8:31, news headlines on LBC with Helen Hodinott.
LBC has been told the government will use next month's Queen's speech to introduce proposals to scrap the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's understood the plans would give ministers the power to suspend checks on goods travelling across the Irish Sea, agreed in the Brexit deal. A police investigation for a missing mother of two in Lancashire has changed from a missing person inquiry to a murder hunt. 33-year-old Katie Kenyon was last seen getting into a transit van in Burnley on Friday. And the Education Secretary has told LBC the government is preparing to welcome around 200,000 Ukrainian refugee children into schools here. Nadeem Zahawi says 60,000 Ukrainian families have now arrived in the UK. LBC weather, cloudy with clear spells tonight, chance of the odd shower in the southeast, some frost with a low of 1 degree.
LBC.
Have you lost
With Iain Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
It's 8:34 on LBC. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. Robert Buckland, Paul Mason and Geoff Norcott with me. Geoff, you have the paperback version of your book, Where Did I Go Right? Memoirs of a Working Class Voter. Was that the same as the Hog?
No, we've slightly repitched it because it was going into W.H.
Smith's. Very well.
It's so well, but what we wanted, because we said, where did I go right? How the left lost me. What we thought that there was maybe like quite a lot of lefties would go, well, that's a lot of me, exclusion of me. So, and we realised in a way that the book wasn't just about this story about how I ended up voting Conservative from 2010 onwards. There was a lot of other stuff in there about growing up on a council estate. Yeah. My insane mother,
albeit in Wimbledon.
But my life is full of these contradictions. I mean, I tell you the thing about growing up on a council estate in Wimbledon is there's something sort of harshly ironic about being poor but being able to hear tennis. Hearing tennis just flow. We could actually hear centre court from where we lived if the wind was blowing in the right direction. And so there's a lot more in the book than that. So I suppose one of the points of the paperback was to broaden it out. And like I say, I had this sort of treasure trove of stories from my parents. My mum was a sort of tiger South London tiger mother, and she once hid in a cupboard because one of my teachers was in my view, victimising me. So my mum just thought, I'll find out for myself. So I was getting told off. And then out of a cupboard in the corner of the room appears my mother, grabs this poor woman by her wrist, frog marches her out. And, well, look, I mean, I was shocked, but when I looked...
Were you mortified?
Well, I was mortified.
Did all the other kids know it was your mother?
Well, there's two things. One was it left with me a lifetime belief that my mum might just appear. Whatever bad thing I'm doing, she might appear out of a metaphorical cupboard in my mind. And the other thing it was that it did actually give me a lot of power among the other kids, because I sort of looked at them and I was like, yeah, that's right. Mess with me, mad women appear out of cupboards. So that, you know, they were... some of it is definitely a love letter to my parents.
Yeah. And you've sort of got a little bit disillusioned with the Conservatives, though, haven't you?
Well, look, I'm not saying that the next book will be Where Did I Go Back the Other Way Again, but I think I'm certainly, like a lot of people, I am a Conservative when you look at your core political characteristics, but certainly, and like I say, give the Conservative Party credit on some of the bigger things. I also think there's an issue with conduct, and I think going back to the Owen Paterson affair, there's a sort of bottom line for me in terms of how people handle themselves. How, you know, the Partygate affair certainly comes into it. I don't think it's the single most important thing in government, but you know, I'm in my mid-40s. I like stable, consistent government. I like public servants who sort of look like they're not enjoying it, if I'm honest, because that means they're taking it seriously. I think, you know, I tell you who probably embodied that best was Theresa May and Gordon Brown. They really didn't look like they were enjoying it, which suggested to me that they understood the gravity of office.
Okay. Can either of you compete with the mother in the cupboard anecdote?
I've got many things I could talk about my mum. The best story about my mum is that when I was graduating from Durham University, it was the graduation night, and she was the only mum in the nightclub. And after she went to the nightclub, it became a tradition for the mums and the dads of the students to go to the nightclub. She set the pace back in whenever it was.
So I think I can imagine her in a nightclub and not you.
Don't judge a book by its cover, Ian. I enjoy a good party.
Right,
with
I think we should try.
I mean, party might be the wrong thing to mention at this point.
Well, a party in legitimate circles.
Yeah, legally.
Anyway, Geoff's book, should you wish to buy it, it's a remarkably cheap price of $9.99. Where Did I Go Right? Memoirs of a Working Class Voter by Geoff Norcott, published by, who is it? Octopus. Right, let's move on to Kieran in Limerick. Hello, Kieran.
All right, how are you? I'm just wondering, will Get Brexit Done be the slogan for the Tory party in the next election?
Well, it's done, isn't it? Look, Kieran?
I don't really think it is. I mean, why are they whinging about Northern Ireland still? Or why do they constantly bring up things to be renegotiated all the time if it's done?
I can't imagine anyone whinging about Northern Ireland, least of all me, because we're hoping to do the programme from Northern Ireland in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. Geoff, let's come to you, because you are a Brexiteer. Kieran wants to know if that's going to be the slogan for the next election for the Tories. Would it be a winning one?
First off, I don't want to split hairs, but I always thought Brexiteer slightly overstated my position. I think
you voted Leave?
Well, yeah, that's what I see it as. And I know, but I think Brexiteer was an ideological thing whereby you'd thought about it in your life before the run-in to that referendum. referendum, whereas I was somebody that heard the arguments and came down on the side of leave. I mean, certainly with our friend who's calling in from Limerick, I guess that the news today about the border is one of the key things, and it's one of those issues that the idea of instigating that process, I don't think it fills anybody it doesn't feel good. There's a lot of potential pitfalls there, certainly with President Joe Biden, who's very sympathetic, at least, to the Irish view on things. But I also think that if we're honest, most of us knew that the point was, and this was true for the EU as well, was people didn't want no deal. People were trying to legislate against no deal. So at that point, the uncertainty by the ongoing sort of delay of Brexit was becoming a danger in itself. So the main thing at that point was to get out. I think it was clear at some point that the idea that Britain and the UK can't move goods freely within there was going to come up for re-evaluation. But no, I don't feel comfortable with going at loggerheads with the EU, particularly at this point in time. But I do think it was kind of inevitable.
Paul, when you look at the slogan for the last election, which was "Get Brexit Done," will there be some sort of Brexity slogan, do you think, for the Conservatives at the next election, given that they're up against Keir Starmer, who, of course, was Shadow Brexit Secretary, and they're going to want to remind Red Wall voters of that fact?
Oh, they can do that as much as they like, but the fact is that I don't think we can or should, in this generation, attempt to rejoin the European Union. It's impossible. I lament the fact that we didn't go for a much softer and much closer trade relationship in the first place with Europe. We could have done that. But the problems now are bigger. As we've been doing, backing out of the one big 30-year investment in a sort of socio-economic dream, an international arrangement, we've backed out of that. Where has the world gone? On the 4th of February, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin signed a declaration saying totalitarianism are us, for China, for Russia. We will assemble around us now, and they're busy doing it. All countries in the Commonwealth, countries in Latin America, to be part of a world bloc that's not about trade, it's about politics, it's about ethos. Now, fine, okay, we stand by values that, despite you're a Conservative, you voted Conservative, I'm very strongly left Labour. We have some shared values. We share some of those values with Europe, we share them with America, we share them with Japan. We can geopolitically stand together for those values, but do we really want to, in the middle of that, to be playing nip and tuck over the Northern Ireland border? Do we want to be withdrawing from, say, European space, European defence initiatives, which we've done? I would argue no, and I would urge the Conservatives to core, a lot of them, even the ultra-Brexiteers, to think very hard about the economic and the geopolitical at the same time. A lot of people like me just think we've needlessly ripped up relationships and goodwill, and even on the pure trade thing, we're left making trade deals with Australia, with India, on very weird terms, to be honest. The one area that we need to be trading with on preferential terms is Europe, and the other country we need to be trading with on as preferential as possible is the United States, and we're nowhere near a settled relationship with either of them. So maybe that will be, if the kind of ultra-Brexiteers want to make that an issue, then maybe they'll make that an issue. Maybe, it depends when the election is, there'll be the possibility of a clear possibility of a Republican presidency. So what would that mean? Could you then envisage a fast-track trade relationship with America? I hope not. I just think we need to be in the game of alliance building on economics, on trade, on geopolitics, and unfortunately on the military. Because
the Trade Minister, Penny Mordaunt, she says she's got 20 trade deals ready to go with individual states.
Well, A, how big are these states? B, what's better about them? Legitimate question, because if it is better, well, fine. And C, I've got Penny Mordaunt at 35 to 1 to be the next Prime Minister of this country.
I'm with you.
I wouldn't be unhappy with that.
Whenever her name's mentioned, the tweet and text screen here goes mad.
Well,
so I think it's a wise man.
Because she stayed out of... I don't know whether she was one of the 6 who said, I'm not voting for this, junior front benchers who said, I'm not voting for this procedural motion. But she stayed out of it. If you notice, Elizabeth Truss is kind of in the game, and so was Rishi Sunak until he kind of bit the dust a bit. But Penny Mordaunt sort of sat there sort of serenely being a junior minister, attending various functions. I saw her at a Commons function. I thought, you look like someone who's kind of networking here, don't you? So, yeah, I think 35-1 was a good...
Has she networked you, Robert, yet?
Oh, but Benny and I go back a long, long way, and I think she's a very effective minister. I've always rated her very, very highly, but, you know, I'm not here to talk about a Tory leadership. I've been involved in more Tory leadership contests than I really want, than I'd like to talk about now. But let's come back to the question. Look, Brexit was done, right? What we are dealing with now is some of the consequentials from the very tricky issue about the interplay between the single market that the EU is entitled to defend in terms of its integrity and the unity of the United Kingdom. And there are definitely issues about East-West trade across the Irish Sea. There are problems. Some of the way in which the terms are being implemented is causing that dislocation. Therefore, it's entirely legitimate for the UK government to raise those issues and seek to negotiate a change to that. You know, and people can say, well, you know, you signed the deal only a year or so ago, and you know, look, that was part of a very big deal, wasn't it? First of all, the withdrawal of the EU from an institution, from Britain from the EU, from an institution it had been in for the thick end of 50 years, and secondly, the negotiation of a future trade arrangement was hugely important. You know, I was one of these people that believed, you know, we needed a deal. A deal was good for the country. What we're left with now is the fine-tuning, the precise mechanism by which we seek to change some of the terms of the protocol. You know, we've got this legal structure. The issue really now is how far does the UK go in implementing any unilateral change?
Well, according to my colleague Ben Kentish, he has discovered today, and it hasn't been denied, that in the Queen's speech there will be an announcement they're effectively going to blow up the Northern Ireland Protocol unilaterally.
And let's remember that I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Paul. I mean, first of all, you can't blow up an international agreement like that via legislation. You can pass legislation. Well, that's different. I mean, if you're going to do that, you need to do that properly in the international way. You need to renounce the agreement and say we're no longer tied by it. I don't think the United Kingdom government is going to be doing that, because the consequences at this time, I think, will be pretty baleful. Bearing in mind, you know, a lot of what Paul said is right. You know, in terms of how we need to work internationally, and I think Geoff had some concerns as well, which I agree with. So the question is, if we are to go down this legislative route, when and if do we ever bring this into force? When are we going to need this legislation? I would hope and expect British ministers to continue to be negotiating hard and diligently in order to resolve these disputes. Yes, to be prepared to take action in the interest of the United Kingdom. Clearly, that's legitimate. But to work as hard as possible within the framework that we have to resolve a lot of these issues.
I think the problem is that the war in Ukraine has effectively cut off anything now, and the European Commission, in many ways, understandably, are saying, well, look, let's deal with this first.
I mean, let's remember, it was the Conservative government, Boris Johnson, newly enshrined, that decided to make a deal that drew a trade border down the Irish Sea and not on the Northern Ireland Irish Republic border. That was their choice. That was you're thinking the no deal versus a deal. That was the deal they came up with. It was something that they designed with Leo Varadkar, the Irish Taoiseach. To say no, we don't want that. Actually, because
well, you can say it because it clearly isn't working for some sectors of the Northern Irish economy.
But if there's goodwill, as Robert says, then you can make it work. But it's not just a trade thing; it's a political thing. Yeah. The moment there is a trade border across the island of Ireland, there is effectively a border across the island of Ireland that means something. And let's remember, it is likely on the 5th of May that Sinn Féin will be the largest party in the Northern Ireland Assembly. There will be already a huge tension, because that's the first time that's ever happened, huge political tension in a place that's still a tinderbox. You know, those of us who've visited it know that there are severe enmities still in people's minds. If the British government chooses at that moment, at a moment when everybody's still getting their head around the First Minister being a Republican, to say, OK, by the way, you know, this thing we did about the border, forget that. I don't think that'll go down very well in America. And it's America, not the European Union, that matters ultimately there.
Right, thank you very much for that, all three of you. We'll come back to your questions in just a moment. It's 8:48 on LBC.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Conservative MP and Armed Forces Minister James Heappey. I sense you'll be on exactly the same page as I with the newspaper that wrote that article about Angela Rayner. The content was offensive and ugly and misogynistic.
All female colleagues journalists that I've spoken to have reflected to me that what was said about Ange is reflective of what they have to deal with day in, day out.
But should the author and possibly the editor be called in by Sir Lindsay Hoyle?
I think if Lindsay had gone down a route of threatening the access of that journalist to House of Commons, that would have been a mistake, but he hasn't.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player, LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
It is 9 minutes to 9 on LBC. Let's go to our next question. It's Christine in Southend. Do you find that with all these concerns about being woke and not offending people, it's difficult to have a public-facing role, and even more difficult to be a comedian, Robert? But I mean, Geoff Norcott.
Well, first off, I've been in Southend doing my tour show on Friday, so let's see. I might make it look very difficult being a comedian.
I'm there the next Sunday, but not doing a tour show.
Well, look, you'll probably get more laughs than me. I've been in Manchester and Maidstone. And look, the truth is, in terms of live shows, it's never been a more exciting time.
Well, you're at Maidstone, I can come and see you.
Come down Hazlitt Theatre on Sunday. I think we're about 75%.
I can do that.
Yeah, please come to the show. Always nice to see a friendly face in Maidstone.
That'll sell you tickets. If I'm there, the people of Kent will come and see you.
Yeah, you know, it looked like it's sort of like what's the opposite of the metropolitan liberal elite? We are liberals.
You.
Let's be me. Well, yeah. Look, I'm mellowing at my old age. One thing I would say is that, as is often the case, increasingly these days, I find myself between two arguments. On the one hand, there's kind of perhaps people on the more left, kind of progressive side that will mock the idea that you can't say anything these days, you know, and they will often use words like free speech warrior, and then often think that's a funny thing to explain to people outside of social media as to why that's a bad thing. But equally, you know, it can be overstated, the restrictions on us as comedians, but it's a fact that the consequences for saying stuff are higher than they have been. And it's not just about what you're saying.
Try presenting a radio show for 4 days a week for 3 hours and thinking, I've got to stay on that tightrope.
I would just wake up in the middle of the night going, what did I say? But I think that what people sometimes miss in terms of like topical comedy on radio and television, it's not just like what subject you do and what you say about it in the record, it's the choice of subjects. And I've seen a lot of topical shows lately. I'm not going to name names because they're doing it for, you know, not immoral reasons, but they're scared of topics. They are scared of topics. And I'll give you an example. I did a topical piece recently where I made a joke about the trans debate. everyone always tenses up when you say that. It wasn't a bad joke. It wasn't mean. It wasn't hurtful. It was just a correlation between Keir Starmer and his tendency towards constructive ambiguity. You can probably finish the joke yourself, right? It does sound like
I'm not going to, though.
It does sound like a gender invented by lawyers, right? That was all it was. It was a very light joke. It got a laugh in the room, and but it didn't make the edit. And I understand why producers do that. So perhaps if people are on the right, the thing that they might think is that things are being edited out because they're too right-wing or unwoke. The truth is now, more and more, people are avoiding subjects completely. And, the talk about the balance in left and right-wing comedy on television, have a look at how many topical shows remain on television. There aren't that many, because broadcasters are scared, because, truthfully, given the scale of backlash on both sides from them, it's not worth the bother.
How do you see that, Paul?
I draw a distinction between what is said on platforms with great influence by people with great influence and what ordinary people say. And the last thing in the world I would want is for anybody to not be able to voice their fears, their concerns, their genuine beliefs. I'll give you an example. At the last election, a bloke came up to me in Lee, where I come from, was campaigning, and he said, "You won't let me say what I want to say to you." And I said, and the candidate said, "Go on then, say it." And he said, "No, you won't." And then when he said it, to be honest, it was a genocidal thought about Romanians. That's what it was. Now, I'm glad I heard it, because I was able to ask him questions about why this was. And what he meant gypsies by when he was to Romanians. And it's Gypsy Road Traveller Day today. So, look, I'm very happy. Well, happy, I would say, in a wrong word. It's our duty to have a reasoned, have a fair discussion with people like that about what their beliefs are and why they believe them. What I wouldn't like to see is someone making a joke with that content on a high-profile platform. And let's face it, I'm old enough, you are, maybe you're not, to remember the days of the kind of Bernard Manning, Charlie Williams, and the rest of it, the Jim Davidson, when all humour was the humour of cruelty against minorities. So, I'm not somebody who gets wound up by these things. It just flows over me. And as you know, Ian, on Twitter, I just face a barrage of insult every day, every hour. But I want us to be able to be a society that laughs at our weaknesses and our hypocrisies, absolutely, on all sides.
But the point I'm making is that some subjects have become seen as so incendiary and dangerous, is that the people that do topical comedy literally won't go there. Whether you're gender critical or very pro-trans, people literally won't engage with that area because of the peril involved.
Yeah, and I think one of the hallmarks of British society and discourse has been our ability to disagree in a polite, civil way. That is being eroded in some respect. There are some topics where that sort of civilised disagreement can't seem to take place, and we need to be worried about this. And I think what's happened, Ian, is that too many people think that my freedom is the right not to be offended. Well, I'm sorry, that line is it's in the wrong place. I take the point about grossly offensive comments and things that fall, frankly, within the criminal law. But if I had a penny for every time I was offended, then nobody would be able to say anything, and that can't be right. And we've got to make sure that the boundary is as wide as possible, and within that space, people can then have vigorous and sometimes really quite stormy debate, but in a way that ultimately respects that traditional civilized disagreement.
I would agree with that in general, but you have to base some facts. The young people don't necessarily feel that way. For them, the language war on all sides, on the alt-right or on the left, woke left, you want to say this, is very important. And the problem we've got is that both parties, both Labour and Conservative, when in power, have commercialised higher education. So students are now consumers. They want their money's worth. They want to say in what it is that they are taught. I know they don't want to say in what is quantum physics, but a lot of them do want to say in what can be said at university. And we've got ourselves into a problem where they have the right to do that because they're effectively the customers of higher education. If we're going to solve that problem, and I think if you find most of the anti-woke stuff, a lot of it's generated by examples from higher education.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, I think developing that point, I think the problem is that actually students don't have enough say in the content of their, the quality of their education, and therefore, because they can't actually have a say in what really matters in terms of the cost of their degree, there's displacement activity in other areas, and that's why you see this sort of quite.
Can I just say, on an optimistic note, creatively, obviously, I've pointed to the problems that mainstream broadcasters have in terms of topical comedy and subject matter. As I said earlier, like live comedy is great because you have nuance. You're in the room with somebody. You can tell whether somebody has meanness in their heart or sort of malevolent intent. And the other place for comedians is podcasts. There are a lot of great podcasts out there, which a lot of people like me do everything ourselves. We edit it ourselves. We put it up ourselves. Obviously, if you were saying horrific things that, as you say, contravene the law on an ongoing basis, but if the caller or the person that texted in feels that comedians are self-censoring, all I would say is check out the podcasts that are out there. There's lots of brilliant podcasts, and go to a live gig, because live comedy has never been more precious than it is now.
What's your podcast called?
Well, it's really funny you say that. It's called What Most People Think. But I think that there's podcasts that aren't politically motivated, but also really go for the jugular comedically, like Have a Word podcast, which is very big at the moment with Adam Rowe and Dan Nightingale. There's a lot of comedians that are now putting, just like the American comics do, putting their time into podcasts, and those are not unfiltered, but certainly they're certainly blunt and honest.
And who's your guest on next week's podcast?
So again, this week it's coming out tomorrow is Chris Foden, and then we've got a really big guest for the
next week
prior to the local election special is the one and only Iain Dale.
Now, final.
We should apologise for an all-male panel.
Again, I did mention it at the beginning, but it's not our fault, because we were to have Sarah Jones, the Shadow Labour Policing Minister, on the programme, but very shortly before she had to pull out. It's not her fault. We didn't have time to get a replacement. So we don't normally... we have had all-female panels before, Paul, I should point out. So final fun text question. Ian's been doing a bit of baking today, according to my Twitter feed. Panel, what's your favourite cake, pastry or bread? Well, just to prove that I have been baking today, if you're watching on Global Player, you can see what I'm doing. I've got such a big head, I can't get my chef's hat on it. I did earlier. I've been making shallad bread to promote awareness for Shabbat. I was doing it with Angela Rayner, Saji Javid and Pippa Carrera. Can't reveal who won the competition until next week. Favourite cake, Robert?
Oh, it's easy. My lemon drizzle, which I used to bake for my... Oh, come on, you haven't tried mine. It's a special secret recipe, and I used to bake it for my private secretaries, and I tell you, that really improved morale, and they'd be coming into the office for that if I was still in
Paul?
Pastel de nata. Portuguese custard tart.
Oh, yeah.
With the brown top.
Yes.
Oh, God. Pastel de nata.
It'd be my mum's Dundee cake. It was so heavy, when she put it down, you would hear the thud on the table, and she put it like with a pint of milk. It was like elephant tranquilizer. It would knock you out for 7 hours.
You can't beat an Eccles cake, I think. Right. Thank you very much indeed, Robert Buckland, Paul Mason and Geoff Norcott. Coming up in the next hour, I'm going to take this off now because I feel ridiculous. Coming up in the next hour, we are going to talk about James Heapy's comments, the Defence Minister, who said that it would be quite right for Ukraine to send missiles into Russia. The Russians have reacted furiously to this. Should he have said it? 0345 6060 973. It's 9:02.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Lord Mandelson has warned possible plans to tear up the Northern Ireland Protocol would jeopardise peace and stability. LBC has learnt the government will